We continue to look at a letter that Peter wrote to the church that was spread out over the Roman Empire. Another name for this kind of sermon series we're doing is Pastor Nathan's Gripes About Hope, why he doesn't like the word. And so as I continue to think about why I don't like the word, it is because hope requires two things. Hope requires you to be both honest and hopeful. When you're hopeful without honesty, hope doesn't really work. Think about this. You are dating someone new, and they meet all of your friends for the first time, and your friends approach you after the night out, and they say, hey, that guy you're dating is kind of a jerk. And then you say, well, he will change, right? But then he doesn't, right? There's hope that he'll change, but there's a lack of honesty of who he really is. Again, you could think, you know what, life is kind of kicking me in the teeth. It will get better. And then it doesn't, right? Hope requires honesty. You need to be both honest and hopeful. If God was going to tell us who he was in a book through written word, you'd hope that he would be both honest and hopeful, right? If all the Bible was just this hopeful book where we talked about how to improve your life, how to do life hacks and become more productive, how to make your life actually good, well, it wouldn't be honest. It wouldn't be honest with how our lives actually are. No, instead, when God discloses who he is to us through Scripture, we get words that are both honest and hopeful. It says that he came to condemn, which actually we know humanity. We can think of it as kind of bad at times, but he comes not just to condemn, but to save. It's both honest and hopeful. So today's letter that Peter writes, I want you to imagine that there is a church gathered together. Let's say about 50 people gathered together for worship. It's about 30 years after the resurrection, and this church is gathered together and they're worshiping. But something happens in worship, and I know this is true for you. You start to think about all of the circumstances surrounding outside of this hour, don't you, right? I know, I'm not judging you for it. It's just how it goes. You sit in worship and you begin to think about what the week has for you, what you're going to face. These Christians who are gathered, just about 50 of them together, start to think about all that's going wrong around them. And they start to wonder, how am I going to face the week? How am I going to face the world outside of these church walls? There's problems. There are persecuted people. They say the emperor, he hates us. He blames us for things that are going wrong in the empire. He blamed them actually for a fire that was started that destroyed much of Rome. They're thinking about their jobs that they have to go back to on Monday morning. They think about their unfair boss. He knows who they are. He knows they're Christians, and he treats them unfairly. And they're wondering, how long can I keep this charade up, keep going to this job? No, they know that outside of those walls, they're going to be made small. They're going to be snickered, jeered. There's going to be gossip. There's going to be angry eyes going their direction. Now, the 2023 answer, if you're a persecuted or marginalized people, is, I don't know, write a letter to a senator, maybe protest, tweet. I don't know. What do you do? What do you do when you're a people group that's being made small and persecuted? Well, with 50 people in there, you have to wonder, should they just fight? Should they fight for their rights? Should they fight and try to make life better for themselves? But let's be honest, in the Roman Empire, when you have no rights, you fight, and the entire church overnight, death is coming their way. So what do we do? They're sitting in worship asking the question, how do we face the world outside of these walls? What should you tell that church, those people gathered? Well, here's what Peter writes. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. It's hopeful. He says, don't you know who you are? There's something going on here that's of eternal importance. That God is actually working out his plan of salvation so that actually through you, more might come to know who Jesus is. He says you're a chosen people, a royal priesthood. He's hopeful. But the questions still persist. And that's why he's honest. He writes to them and he looks at them and he says, I know you're suffering. I know that the emperor, he's a tyrant, but you have to honor him. I know that the laws are unjust, but you're going to follow them, you're going to obey them. I know that the government officials think less of you and marginalize you, but you are going to submit to them. I know your boss, he actually thinks less of you because of who you are, because you follow Jesus, but you're going to keep working. You're not going to argue with him. So because all of it was expected, you're exiles, you're living in a place that's not your home, you don't belong here, you don't have Roman citizenship, you actually have citizenship in heaven, with the Father at the right hand. That's where your citizenship is. But know that when you are mistreated, something greater is at stake. Because you chosen people, are a royal priesthood. You're not fighting for power and control over governments and government officials. You're fighting powers of evil and darkness. Well, that went over like a lead balloon. He looks at them and he knows that they're hurting. He knows that they're underpaid, they're not paid fairly. He knows what they're going to face. I'm sure many of them had marks on their body to show that persecution. And so someone speaks up. Peter, it's not right. We got to do something. Something has to change. We've got to do something about this. And then Peter tells them that there was one night that he was in the garden when Jesus was actually arrested and betrayed. And Peter, he took a sword, and while he went to go strike a soldier right at the core of the head, the soldier ducked and it cut off his ear. And actually, Jesus took that ear and put it back on his head. So actually, we know that we must suffer. We must suffer and die because rebellion is not an answer. Another one speaks up and says, how much longer do we have to keep going? How much longer are we going to keep having to suffer unjustly? We know that Jesus said we would have to carry our crosses, but we didn't know it was going to be like this. Well, I'm unqualified to talk about unjust suffering. My life is going pretty well. I think most of us in this room have rarely experienced such unjust suffering. So we need to let Peter talk today. Peter wrote the letter. Peter knows what suffering looks like, to suffer unjustly. A legend tells us that Peter was actually martyred. He was crucified too, and actually legend says he was maybe even crucified upside down because he didn't want to be seen as Jesus. No, he knew what unjust suffering was. And so Peter tells us what's going on. So we need to listen to him. Why suffer unjustly? Why should you suffer unjustly? Here's what he writes. He writes this: suffer unjustly, for this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Do good to those who are foolish, because it will shame their oppressive power. Do good so that those who oppress are shamed by your good actions. On Sunday nights, we get together with some youth over at Messiah Lutheran Church, and one day I came in, and I am trying to straddle this line of if I'm going to be like the dad who lays down the law or like kind of like the cooler pastor. I'm going to let like a pastor above me tell the kids when they're being bad. But one time they were looking at their phone, and they were watching a video, and it was a pretty gruesome video of a fight that actually happened at their school. And there was a fight taking place, and there was someone who was getting punched in this fight. And he had his hands behind his back in the bathroom over at Roosevelt High, and he's taking punches to his face, and he's eating punches. And then finally the fight stops, and the kids go, "Isn't it so cool how he didn't punch back? He's a legend around our high school." I was like, oh my goodness. First off, the reality of your high school is kind of blowing my mind, right? But second, the one who took the punches shamed the one who was throwing them. Jesus says if you get slapped on one cheek, just turn your other. If someone asks for your tunic, then just give them your cloak, because if you stand there naked after someone robs you, it's actually going to shame the person who robs you, right? To suffer unjustly will shame oppressive powers. Pastor Jeff tells a story about his mentor, John Schmicke, up in North City. May 12th, he's going to have died a year ago. On May 12th will be a year where John Schmicke actually is awaiting the resurrection in Jesus' hands. But he had this great story about how he looked around the neighborhood in Hyde Park around his church, and he wanted equitable and fair housing around the church. And he had this dream, he had this vision that he could make it work, and they were going to work together to build housing all around this neighborhood. He was going to work with the city, get tax credits and developers to get on board, but there was resistance. Who would have thought that the St. Louis city is a little bit dysfunctional when you try to do a good thing? Who would have thunk it? Well, it turns out that they overcame these hurdles. There were politicians who said, no, we're not going to build the houses, but then the houses were built. Years later, and there was a dedication for all these brand new homes that were changing the neighborhood, transforming the neighborhood. And as they come together on a stage in front of the church, all the politicians in the area show up. The alder person shows up, steps to the mic, and says, "Look what I've done for this area. Look at how we are changing this neighborhood." The alderman was against the project from the beginning, but he was ready to take the glory once it was finished. Well, a couple more people spoke, and then actually John Schmicke, the pastor, got up. And you'd think he'd have a rebuttal. You'd think he could actually yell at the alderman and said, "Ha, in your face, we did it, even though you said no 6 years ago." And instead he says, "These homes show that God is transforming a neighborhood. These homes show that God is at work here. And through these homes, much will be made of Jesus' name." He took it. He sat in all the annoying meetings, but he took it. And then at the end, his good works shamed the oppressors. That's what it does. Unjust suffering shames oppressive forces. Here's what else it does. Peter actually says this: unjust suffering will actually make you more like Christ. Unjust suffering will make you more like Jesus. Here's what he writes: "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps." Christ leaving an example after his unjust suffering. He leaves an example so that you would become more like Jesus. I was trying to think of the opposite of unjust suffering, and I think I have a good picture of it. I discovered this on Friday afternoon. Friday is my day off, and on Friday afternoon, I sit on a couch, I watch TV, I think only of myself. I eat a frozen pizza that I baked. It's only a 10-inch frozen pizza. It's not that big. No, I'm finding that maybe the opposite of unjust suffering is actually self-sufficiency. only worrying about yourself. But suffering will do something funny to you. Suffering will take away your comfort. Suffering will take away any false trust you have in things that are not trustworthy. And suffering will force you to rely on others. It will rely on you to look at those around you. And actually, this is the pattern of Jesus that you are becoming. That actually Jesus looked not only to his own interests, but the interests of others. He did not count equality with God something that he should have, but instead gave himself up. No, there's something about suffering that takes away any kind of self-sufficiency, becoming inadequate for oneself. No, actually, in suffering, you will become more Christ-like. The last one I want to share. Unjust suffering will actually show you the heart of God. Unjust suffering will show you the heart of God. Here's what he writes to the church, those who were gathered and persecuted. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in Jesus' mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. No, in suffering and unjust suffering, the heart of God is revealed. Peter actually points back to the cross. Peter actually points back to a trial that was unfair. Jesus did everything right, and they told him he did everything wrong, and so he would unjustly suffer, and he was hung on a cross. It was actually meant to shame, to cause suffering, becoming a spectacle. And Jesus, who had done everything right, was now put on a cross. It was unjust suffering. But what do you learn about the heart of God looking at Jesus who hangs on a cross? What do you learn about who God is when you see Jesus unjustly suffer? Martin Luther King Jr. has a quote, and he said this in the context of the civil rights movement, but he says this: "Unearned suffering is redemptive. Unearned suffering is redemptive." Unearned suffering is redemptive. You imagine those words coming out in the time of civil rights, and you can imagine he was saying, we're going to be peaceable, we're going to suffer unjustly, we're going to beat up, we're going to be slighted, we're going to be marginalized, but it's going to shame those who oppress us one day. Because actually through this, they're going to realize that we in the civil rights movement, we want reconciliation, we want forgiveness, and they just want to beat us down. But unearned suffering, that's what's happening to us. It will be redemptive. Well, Martin Luther King Jr. did his work in the civil rights movement, but we also know he was a man who proclaimed the gospel. We know he was a man who, in unearned suffering, found redemption for himself and for others. See, actually, in this unearned suffering, that's how you were redeemed. Jesus himself put on a cross your life tied to his. The unearned suffering of Jesus Christ puts him in your place so you don't have to die, so that you are forgiven, you are set free. And so all of the riches of God are given up so that you become rich. He becomes poor for you. Unearned suffering is redemptive, and that is what Jesus has done for you. His sacrifice, his suffering for your life. It means everything for us. I was given those two words. Your pastor, Jeff, over at Christ Memorial, he's also here. He said we're going to preach on hopeful suffering. It requires honesty. You have to be both honest and hopeful. Otherwise, it's not actually hope. This last week was what's called a multi-ethnic symposium at the seminary. The seminary is a place where they train pastors up in Clayton area. Zach is there, Noah's there, we got a couple others hanging around. And at this symposium, you run into people who have experiences that are way different than mine, way different. And through a friend, I met a gentleman named Hundi. He grew up in Ethiopia about 22 years, has now been in America for 17 years. And we went out to Schlafly for some beers and some food, and we took him out, and there was another missionary that was friends with Hundi that I didn't know. And what I found is that Hundi's friend had come to St. Louis, so now he would be sent out to other places. He was a missionary over in East Africa. And he's explaining to us that he's in St. Louis so he can get on a flight to Chicago and then get over to East Africa. And so Hundi says, "Where are you headed?" And he says, "I'm headed to South Sudan." And Hundi says, "I wouldn't go there." The missionary again explains he's headed somewhere else, and Hundi again, we're like, "Hundi, stop talking." And he goes, "I wouldn't go there either." Right? But the man who was being sent to South Sudan, he was honest. He knew what was awaiting him. He knew that there was a church, much like the church that 1 Peter was written to. He knew that there was a church that was oppressed, suffering, and he knew that he was the guy that needed to be sent. It required him to be both honest of the call that he had and yet hopeful. And what else would he hope for in the face of suffering than a suffering Jesus? What else would you be sent with other than the story of a God who didn't avoid suffering and instead took up power and control? Take a God who actually deals in love and sacrifice. Don't take a God who's into power and control. And so he was sent with both honesty and hope. You are being sent to places that I'm not going to go. I'm not going to South Sudan. Honestly, I wouldn't suggest it. I'm glad there's someone else going, to be honest. But you are going to friend groups, families, places of work. And in those places, you're called to be honest, and you're called to be hopeful. You're called to be honest about yourself, honest about your shortcomings, honest about the places you've done wrong, honest about the ways you've hurt others. But somehow in that honesty, they'll see hope. They can see the hope that we have in Jesus, a living hope. A hope that doesn't pretend suffering doesn't happen, a hope that doesn't ignore you, but a hope that is both honest and hopeful. And so that's the God we are sent with, the one who suffers with us. Amen.